All right. All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Modjeska Simkins School for Human Rights. This evening, of course, is one of our deeper dive sessions where we take some time to really drill a bit deeper into specific topics relating to many of the themes that really animate the Modjeska School of Human Rights courses during the course of the semester. And tonight, I am honored to introduce two very, very special guests. Uh, Two women who are experts in their field and equally importantly are very committed to the same ideals and the same passions of fighting for social justice and equality for all. And that is, of course, Dr. Jennifer Taylor and Millicent Brown. Now, I'm going to introduce both of them briefly, give you some brief bios because both their biographies are incredibly impressive as well. And then we're going to get started first with Dr. Taylor and then Dr. Brown. So I want to just read you guys the bios for both of our presenters this evening. First, Dr. Jennifer Whitmer Taylor is Assistant Professor of Public History at Duquesne University in Pittsburgh, where she specializes in contested commemoration, historic house museums, oral history, and digital history. She earned her PhD from the University of South Carolina, where she was active in the public history community. Her 2017 co-authored article, Reconstructing Memory, the attempt to designate Beaufort, South Carolina, the National Park Service's first Reconstruction unit, explores how historical memory, Confederate flag debates, and changes to interpretation at Civil War battlefields worked in tandem to allow a 2003 campaign by the Sons of Confederate Veterans to derail congressional and NPS efforts to preserve the birthplace of Reconstruction. Her current book project traces the transformation of the Woodrow Wilson family home in Columbia into the nation's first museum of Reconstruction. In 2019, she wrote a series of 8 podcasts for the city of Pittsburgh on public art and its relationship with local communities for inclusion on the city's GIS map of these memorials. These podcasts complement many oral histories from government officials, residents, preservationists, and artists made available through the map as well. This GIS inventory is believed to be the first in the country to map a city's collection and provide resources for community engagement. So again, that is Dr. Jen Taylor. Please give her a digital round of applause via the emojis and such, or just clap on the screen. We're very glad to have her here. And on a personal note, Dr. Taylor and I are pretty good friends going back to USC, and she has been an inspiration to me for many, many years. Now, speaking of folks who are very inspiring, let's move to Dr. Millicent Brown, who is a lifelong community advocate and spokesperson for economic, social, and educational improvements in exploited neighborhoods and communities of color throughout the South, the nation, and the world. She specializes in ongoing analyses of the modern civil rights movement and explores social justice dynamics and intersections of race, gender, caste, and class in contemporary society. Brown is co-founder and project director of an oral history initiative to identify the first children, like herself, to desegregate previously all white schools. It's titled the Somebody Had to Do It Project. That's a great name for a project, by the way. She has held a variety of history and museum-related faculty positions and serves as consultant for numerous museums, historic sites, and social justice programs in North and South Carolina. She earned her PhD from Florida State University, and before that, earned her BA from College of Charleston and her MED from the Citadel. And she's worked at a lot of different institutions, including Claflin University, where I'm currently based, North Carolina A&T, Guilford's College, Hofstra University, Bennett College for Women, and College of Charleston. So also give a warm digital round of applause to Dr. Millicent Brown. So again, we are very, very pleased to have both these presenters here this evening. Everyone here is in for a treat. And we'll start with Dr. Taylor. So Dr. Taylor, take it away, please.
Let me unmute Story of My Life.
Well, Jennifer, before you start, let me tell people that if you want to have the speaker kind of front and center, you can go up to the right-hand corner that says View, and you can click on Speaker. And then you just see a few people, but the speaker dominates your screen, and you can click Gallery and see lots of people and the speaker. I'm sorry, Jennifer, go ahead.
Oh, no problem. Thank you all for coming today, and I really appreciate this invitation to speak to you all. I do have some slides to share with you all, not really to lecture at you, but it's public art, memorials, and so I think sometimes visuals help in this conversation. And I also want to give you a little bit of background about how we got these monuments and sort of what they're doing today, and hopefully that will help facilitate a conversation after we wrap things up. So I'm going to take a moment here to screen share. And I think everybody can see that. Okay, good. I'm going to hide faces here so everybody can see clearly. I have some social media contact. If you like to reach out and finish the conversation, you are more than happy to do so. I'm on Twitter and I'm also on Instagram. And today I want to talk to you about the legacies of Lost Cause commemoration. Some of this you've probably heard. It's become a topic that certainly since 2017, that we've been grappling with as a nation, but hopefully I'll be presenting some new stuff for you as well to help you think about what these memorials have done in the past and what they're doing today. So I'm gonna move this down here. Hold on, move it maybe over here. So where do our monuments come from? Some of these images that I've screen grabbed are coming from Historic Columbia. They actually have a really great online tour you can do and a series of podcasts if you want to learn more about the memorialization that takes place at the State House grounds. But here I thought I would show you the most famous in that it is in front of the State House, and it is a memorial to the Confederacy. Not a particular soldier, but in general to the movement. So I've got the sort of larger picture here, as well as one that is zoomed in on the inscription. And I just want you to take a moment and see if you can locate the date. Almost any monument you encounter will have some sort of information about its installation. And I think that those are really important as we think about time periods when they're erected and how to understand these monuments better. So hopefully by now you've seen this here unveiled May 13th, 1879. Now this is just 4 years after we start seeing a lot of these campaigns emerge, 4 or 5 years in Mississippi. Of course, in 1876 was the campaign in South Carolina that ended Reconstruction. So within 3 years, you're seeing a Confederate monument emerge as a response to certainly the gains made during Reconstruction. But I want to talk a little bit about how these kind of monuments come to be on our landscape, particularly in our public spaces that are devoted to the public, right? And should represent all of us. And we really see a tremendous role played by the United Daughters of the Confederacy, or the UDC. Karen Cox is the foremost authority on this, and she has a wonderful book, Daughters of Dixie, if you're interested in reading more about this. But what we know about cementing the lost cause is there's these 2 phases. The first part of the lost cause is bereavement, mourning the generation of men who didn't return home. And that's really happening during Reconstruction. And then phase 2 begins post-Reconstruction by celebrating Confederate virtues. So this is really where we begin what we think of traditionally as the lost cause, states' rights, right? That turns this military defeat in the Civil War into a political and cultural victory for the South, particularly on the issue of states' rights and ensuring white supremacy will endure. To give you an idea of the size of this organization, it peaks around World War I. So in the 19 teens, it is the largest women's club in the nation, bar none. And it has about 100,000 members. So a couple years before the war breaks out, you can see here some of the active members of the United Daughters of the Confederacy. It was formed in 1894, though, so it doesn't take very long for these women to really become major influencers in our political landscape and our cultural landscape. And so what Karen Cox argues is that these women begin a process of vindication and memorialization. And they do this through memorials, benevolent work, historical writing, as well as sponsoring historical essay contests. So to give you context, Woodrow Wilson at one point was a judge for one of their history contests leading up to his presidency. In education, most specifically in the monuments and the textbooks. And I suspect some of you had exposure at some point to Mary Sims Oliphant's textbooks that were in circulation for most of the 20th century until the 1980s. That would be an example of the continuation of these kind of textbooks the UDC generated. And then, of course, they held social events, fundraising, things like that. But hands down, the most visible symbols were the monuments and the flags that they intentionally placed at public spaces like courthouses and town squares, and most certainly what we see at the State House in Columbia, South Carolina. They also were able to gain more respect and traction because they really are providing the social safety net for Confederate veterans and widows. And of course, a key role here.
You think that's it?
Is
United Daughters of the Confederate.
Oh, I just wanted to make sure I was okay. Are the children of the Confederacy. They want to indoctrinate the next generation to continue this work. And if you look here, this is actually the postcard of a statue found on the State House grounds. And if you notice here, right, installed April 1912, sort of at the peak of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, but this statue honoring the women of the Confederacy. So certainly this is not just upholding the men of the Confederacy in their memory, but the work of women as well. And we can see other examples across the State House grounds. I thought the highways are really interesting. If you look here, eventually the interstates replaced these, but in 1923, we install the Jefferson Davis Highway marker here. And if you look, right, the United Daughters of the Confederacy here are responsible for this. 15 years later, the Robert E. Lee Memorial Highway Stone is placed. Again, another UDC installation. And when that one was dedicated, you can see here what happens on the grounds of the State House. There are 1,000 people that gather in red, white, and blue garb to form a living Confederate flag. And so this is 1938, right? Long after the Civil War. I mean, we're getting closer to the centennial, right? Than the 50th anniversary at this particular point. So I want to take a moment. Some of you have maybe seen this, but I want you to take a second, actually more than a second, and do a deep dive into this particular graphic that's gotten a lot of circulation in the last year or so. This was created by the Southern Poverty Law Center, and I put the website up if you ever want to use it or reference it. I find it extremely helpful in the classroom if any of you are teachers. And I'm going to just sort of look at the chat. I'd like you to take a moment and tell me when you are seeing bigger building phases of Confederate iconography. So the green is schools, the blue are monuments, and then all other monuments are featured in red. And you can see here it begins in 1861 with the Civil War, and this was completed in 2016. And this is where I play public history, social engagement. Oh, I got a chat. Let's see. Yeah. So we can see here the 1900s, right? 1900 to 1910. And then we see a surge again in the civil rights movement. Now, that doesn't mean we don't have periods of monument building. In fact, when we're talking about the highways, right? They would be right in this area, which is still a big building period. But we can see this, right, as a response to the end of Reconstruction, the beginning of Jim Crow, and then, of course, the end of Jim Crow with the modern civil rights movement. I know you all have been discussing the state constitution of 1895, right? And so if we're placing that, here's Plessy versus Ferguson. So this is when the state constitution will be rewritten at Ben Tillman's request. And of course, undoing most of those gains that came out of the 1868 Constitution, which of course we know brought public education, for example, one of its most important legacies. And so what we're really seeing here is memorialization that's going to become a cultural symbol of Jim Crow. So you have the intimidation of lynching, you have the codification of it via the state constitution, and then you have this memorialization that is happening alongside of it. So this brings us to the famous equestrian statue on the State House grounds of Wade Hampton III. And of course, if you just want to look at naming memorialization, there are hundreds of things named after Hampton, from buildings to schools. But at the time that this was erected, and again, you can see as we're heading into this peak of Jim Crow, 1906, this is actually a postcard that you could buy and circulate that's printing just 4 years after the monument's erection. Once again, we can see the United Daughters of the Confederacy here, specifically the local Wade Hampton chapter. And we're also seeing the United Confederate Veterans beginning to participate. But make no mistake, what's going to become the Sons of Confederate Veterans are not the same kind of memorialization movers and shakers as the UDC are. So when you see these monuments, look for information about when it was erected, who erected it, and how it was paid for. Sometimes it's state legislatures, sometimes it's fundraising, but this all will give you extra information to help interpret these sites, particularly if you're trying to add context to these sites when removal is not possible. I'm just going to check the chat real quick and make sure. I'll come back and answer some of these. Okay. So I encourage you all to visit Historic Columbia's website and take a look at the monuments. You can just Google monuments and the State House if you want to do a deeper dive into those. But I want to think a little more about how these monuments are continuing to be used today outside of cementing Jim Crow on the public landscape and as a backlash to the civil rights movement. I have a feeling most of you are going to recognize this image. I love this image. I love to share it with my students. It looks a lot different than sort of public spectacle that we might have seen 15 or 20 years ago. Most notably the cell phones, right? We're experiencing things in person, but also virtually through our phones so we can share it, right? If we weren't there recording with our phones, did the Confederate flag come down from the State House? Well, of course it did. Now the monument's still there, but this same flag that was placed atop the dome originally as a response to the civil rights movement and for the commemoration of the Civil War, the centennial, right? Not until after the Charleston Massacre do we get really any traction to remove this from a public space that's meant to serve all South Carolinians. So if you haven't seen this, I thought I would share, this is Dr. Lydia Brandt. She is an expert on preservation, historic structures, monuments, and she did a little video here to explain the problems of Ben Tillman. And I think that you all will connect to this one because I took a look through your reading that you had for this week. And also because I know the 1895 state constitution is looming large in your discussions recently. So I'm gonna let Lydia Brandt do what she does best.
Benjamin Ryan Tillman was governor of South Carolina, senator for South Carolina, and a politician that came out of Reconstruction. He was leader of the Red Shirts, which was the group of white supremacists that intimidated Black and white voters after Reconstruction, effectively ending Reconstruction. He was also the governor that led the charge for a new constitution in 1895, which is probably what he's holding in his hands. The document that effectively disenfranchised African Americans in South Carolina for more than half a century. The monuments on the State House grounds were erected by specific people for specific reasons. Money, dollars were raised by specific people in order to ensure that their ideas would forever be enshrined here on the State House grounds. As you can see here at the Benjamin Ryan Tillman Monument, private citizens donated money to put up this monument to a governor who'd been dead already for 20 years by 1940. So why is a monument erected to Benjamin Ryan Tillman in 1940? What does it mean to declare that he fought for the rights of the common people, as we see on the side of the monument? Who are the common people? Who are the private citizens that erected this monument? Why is he on a pedestal larger than life, this white supremacist?
And of course, it's not a very far line from Reconstruction to Tillman to 1940. He, of course, was very proud of his participation in the Hamburg Massacre in 1876, and often mentioned that in his speeches. And so 1940, to have this monument erected, right, speaks to the enduring power of the white supremacy messaging that came out of Reconstruction and continued well into the 20th century. So one of the things I discovered when I was researching what happened in Beaufort, when the National Park Service attempted to do a theme study circa 2000, trying to make this the first Reconstruction site in the National Park Service, it was completely derailed, actually by Joe Wilson, who introduced the legislation at first, and then ultimately sat on it so it could not move through Congress, or through the House in that case. And he had membership and ties to the Sons of Confederate Veterans. And the backlash that we see in 2000 is actually very much rooted in the 1990s. So perhaps you know that in the 1990s, the National Park Service is required by law to talk about slavery as the key factor in the Civil War. You have to keep in mind, even into the 1990s, the National Park Service was still kind of that nuts and bolts, tell me the details of the battle. And it was Jesse Jackson that introduced this legislation. Ultimately, this comes to pass, and some of the best historians in the country helped draft the narrative for the National Park Service. But it is a backlash to those changes at national parks, Civil War sites, and the flag debates that were happening in South Carolina. There were protests in 2000. You may remember the NAACP having a boycott in South Carolina related to the Confederate flag at the State House grounds. So all of this is coming to a head in the 1990s. And there's a Neo-Confederate Revival that takes place. A group emerges known as the Council of Conservative Citizens, which is actually forming during the Reagan era and going to those white citizen council mailing lists that had been used in the 50s and 60s and using those to find membership. This revival by the 90s is being led by the League of the South. This is a screenshot I took from their website. This was probably about 2016 or so it's certainly been updated. But the Southern Poverty Law Center has classified them as a hate group, and they promoted secession of all of those states that had been part of the Confederacy, as well as the unreconstructed border states, my home state of Kentucky, Maryland, Missouri, and then interestingly, Oklahoma as well. I mention this because this is also fusing with some rhetoric that's making it into mainstream press. So Michael Hill and Thomas Fleming, who founded the League of the South, published what is called the new Dixie Manifesto. You can look this up and read it yourself if you like. It was published in 1995 in the Washington Post. And you're going to recognize this rhetoric here, right? That Hollywood, academia, Wall Street, Washington, D.C., those elites are forging an empire, and they use this language of multiculturalism. They advocate for states' rights, right? Removing federal oversight from schools. We could see this even tied into the segregation schools that we know emerge after the civil rights movement, and of course existed before then as well. But you'll notice here, they also adopt Confederate symbols. So the Confederate iconography, whether it's a flag, a memorial, becomes really important to this Neo-Confederate revival. What happens with the Sons of Confederate Veterans is their radicalization, particularly as this effort to preserve Reconstruction for the National Park Service is happening. In fact, the campaign to try to keep, and I know this is going to sound ridiculous, but to keep the Sons of Confederate Veterans moderate ends up causing a national schism within the organization. So you have more moderate and radical members of the SCV. And they're particularly concerned about these groups like the CCC and the League of the South. And they're trying to encourage their members from not moving over into these more radical groups, discussing really controversial issues like secession, which was not a principle of the SCV. And the split really comes when a man named P. Charles Lunsford, you may not recognize his name, but you know the slogan he created, heritage, not hate, which I think a lot of people that use this believe it goes back much further, but it is a slogan from the 1990s. And when he had spoken to a CCC group, he gets in trouble. And the SCV starts to regulate the use of things like the Confederate flag for white supremacist groups. This campaign by moderates within the SCV to kick out the radicals fails, and they take over the group. And so what you really see is an infiltration of CCC members and other more radical groups into high-ranking positions of the SCV. And I think the 1990s in many ways serves as a foreshadow, as a kind of warning to us of what was going to happen in 2015 and 2017, and the monument debates that began again in earnest and spread across the nation as well. This is the first time we really see cloak and dagger removal of monuments, right, by mayors. You think of New Orleans. And part of that is because they have to protect people that are removing these monuments because they receive death threats and attacks as well. So I want to give a little bit of a trigger warning here. This is some of the footage of white supremacists. Some would have been members of the SCV. Some would have been members of newer organizations that we've seen emerge that are becoming part of the Unite the Right rally. And certainly some of these individuals participated in January 6th. But you can see central to this becomes the Thomas Jefferson Monument.
You will not replace us. You will not replace us. When you are done with the stand, move back. Will not replace us. When you are done with the stand, move back. Replace us.
And I'm going to stop share for just a moment, because what I want to explain about this event is that this is actually a local issue where they were dealing with a General Lee statue. A young lady named Zahana Bryant had first started this petition as a 9th grade student. She was upset about having to walk past these statues every day, and they began to build larger equity to try to get this statue removed. They end up getting certain bills passed for local improvements, also equivalents to come into certain neighborhoods and help with small business. They were really using this as part of an equity package, and it gets passed. And then this is when you see the Unite the Right rally come in support of this statue, which is not really what it's about, right? It becomes a symbol for these larger issues that have been developing in these groups since the 1990s and the messaging that they wanted to share. And what is really interesting is that in the last week, They actually ended up overturning the appeal, and it looks like the Lee statue is going to be removed. She is now a student at the University of Virginia, and she says that this has all come for a full circle for her. But this was, 6 years in the making. And of course, right in the middle of that is when we get the Unite the Right rally. All right, one more quick screen share, and then I'm about done. And so I mention this just because we know that groups that came to the Unite the Right rally, Proud Boys, these various groups that we hear more and more about every day, use Confederate memorials as an issue to coalesce and inspire terror. But we're also seeing these same monuments become a way to express values that are important to other groups. And I think most notably is Monument Avenue. And actually, there had been decisions made that they were going to keep most of the statues. They were only going to remove the Virginians. And then, of course, Charlottesville happened. And that builds momentum for what happens on Monument Avenue. And while we're seeing litigation against finally removing this huge equestrian statue to General Lee, we're beginning to see it used as a means of expression. And so Dustin Klein has been you've probably seen some of these images. George Floyd has been maybe the most famous one, which is now being used for fundraising for Black Lives Matter. Being from Kentucky, of course, Breonna Taylor was a case that resonated with me. And so they've done some really beautiful work to honor her. But I thought I would show you this one because I had not seen it before until I was prepping for this. They're now beginning to add audio. So this is a really short clip.
That it was my intention to work among the 22 million non-Muslim Afro-Americans and to try and form some type of organization or create a situation where the young people, our young people, the students and others, could study the problems of our people for a period of time and then come up with a new analysis and give us some new ideas and some new suggestions as to how to approach a problem that too many other people have been playing around with for too long.
All right. And so that's all I have for you today, but hopefully this spurs some conversation. I'm happy to talk more and more about this.
That's wonderful, Dr. Taylor. Thanks so much for a wonderful presentation. Please give her a great round of applause. I know that there were a couple of questions that were already in the chat. So, Jen, if you want to go ahead and answer those right now, you're more than welcome to. And I'll pose a couple, then we can move on.
Absolutely. Let me take a look here.
And I think the questions I see here include one from, let's see, one from Jackie about what were the logistics in the receiving of these monuments? That is, who could erect, donate, who can receive monuments?
That's a good question. To the best of my knowledge, there was a lot of fundraising, and sometimes this took years. And this is where a lot of the social activities are coming out of, particularly for women's organizations that are supporting this. It also gave women a buy-in into a more political space. And so that's part of the reason that I think some of these women are joining these club movements. Even if it's promoting white supremacy, it was something in the public sphere that you could participate in and feel some source of power. Really, it depends. And this is true of markers or whatever, as far as who can erect and donate. Sometimes things have to be state approved, but things like markers can be private. And of course, we're seeing a series of laws that are passed, like the Heritage Act. They're trying to pass one here in Pennsylvania. I don't think it's going to pass, but take the girl out of the Confederacy, right? But you can still see this even here in Pennsylvania. So who can take them down is becoming a different question, but almost anybody could erect them. If you had money and a designer, and what we've seen from the State House ground is state support for these, you could really put anything you wanted. And then of course, private property, you can erect anything that you want at any time. I do agree with Keith June that the South and the Confederacy, right? When a lot of people use the South, they mean white Southerners and to some degree, white supremacist Southerners, and that's really dangerous. Absolutely, I
Mhm.
agree with that.
Another quick question here. With the Sons of Confederate Veterans, you mentioned the moderate and radical wings of the
Yeah.
organization. What precisely define moderate and radical within the SCV?
I think mainly no discussion of secession, taking these ideas that were more radical. They did not agree with that. They did not want to see people like the KKK using a Confederate flag, much less a League of the South. So borrowing the iconography for clear white supremacy. I mean, I think all of us here would agree that the Sons of Confederate Veterans are committed to preserving white supremacy, particularly on the landscape, but they do not see themselves as secessionists. They do not see themselves as political terrorists. And that's the distinction that I think they wanted to make. Whereas the radical wing, they're infiltrating all groups and they do believe in secession. They do believe white supremacists should use this Confederate iconography. And the language, and particularly the listservs. Remember, this is at the moment where you really begin to see the internet take off. And if you ask me what a huge difference is between political terrorism and paramilitary violence and white supremacy of Reconstruction and today, it's actually the ability to radicalize individuals online, right? This was a community endeavor before, and it still is a community, as we've seen from the Unite the Right rally. But people that showed up there did so often individually, right? From the internet and what they're learning there. So a lot of the radicalization is also taking place on the internet. And that's where the channels are getting crossed. So you're ending up with SCV members that are on these more radical networks, and they're being outed as overt, violent white supremacists.
Okay.
But they're still committed to removal. Like the SCV, even in the 90s, is still mad about the Confederate flag at the State House grounds. It's still mad about these issues on the National Park Service Civil War battlegrounds. Make no mistake, they still want that to stay the same.
Okay. All right. So we'll get to a couple more questions that are already in the chat, because I do want to get to Dr. Brown's presentation as soon as possible. But there are some good questions in the chat here, as always, of course. Another one is, it's understood that the Daughters of the Confederacy gave the monuments, but how were they allowed to be put up? I think kind of addressed this already, but just to reiterate that, why weren't other groups offering up their monuments as well? I think kind of getting to the question of who was able to actually really be in charge or really push the monuments being created during this time period that you talked about.
Having been in Beaufort and done a lot of research there, you see a lot of building and you see a lot of commemoration. It's just not necessarily happening through these memorials that are like obelisks coming up out of the ground. They are typically buildings or communities, or I think of the Penn Center. And it's not that we're not seeing construction happening, it's just not this same kind of memorialization. And even if you could have the National Association for Colored Women erect monuments, you'd still have to get permission from a white controlled legislature. And so that's going to make it really difficult. And I think that's why you now see much more effort to what I kind of call even the public landscape, where it's much easier to get monuments erected to heroes like Ida B. Wells. But even that, right, has taken a really long time. We just removed a controversial statue here to Stephen Foster. I know I have some Kentucky, Pittsburgh people that popped up in here. I've always thought he was from Kentucky. He's not. He's from Pittsburgh. And it's a really offensive statue that they removed. And they were trying to get a Black woman commemorated in this space. And it's still a lot of the same kind of hoops you'd have to jump through. Art commissions, going to a legislature, fundraising, getting buy-in from the public. And I would say that's the biggest difference. There was no buy-in. White supremacists just would have supported this. You're not seeking public approval or deciding, how is this going to make your community feel? What is this space going to do? These kinds of questions we ask today would not have been considered if you were trying to build that monument.
Okay, very quick question. Who paid for the addition of Miss Ellie Mae Washington to the Thurman statue?
I'm pretty sure it's private donations. I looked at that today because I debated about putting it up. It is my favorite statue on the grounds. Now, I love the memorial, the relief to the African-American experience in South Carolina. But what I love about Strom Thurmond statues, I believe I saw it's erected in 2005. And then they, I think, do the name circa 2015. Don't hold me to that date. But I do know that as far as the records Historic Columbia has found, it looks like both the original construction and the change were done by private donations. And if you've never seen this monument up close, go and see Essie Mae Williams' name etched in. They've replaced the 4 with the 5. You know, it's not as worn as a name, so it looks so different. The stark contrast of her name with the white children is a really powerful lesson, I think, if you're trying to, you know, maybe give a guest a tour of the State House.
Okay. All right. And another couple more questions, and then we'll be done with this part of the Q&A. Are the monuments becoming an inconvenience all of a sudden and damaging tourism? Why now is everything on shaky ground with the Confederate battle jack? Is it a pacifier distraction in your mind?
Woo. As far as tourism, I actually think we're seeing an increase in heritage tourism where people want to learn a different history. You're still going to have sites and places that supporters or people that want to hear a Confederate side of the Civil War are going to go to. You're still going to have plantations that do what we used to call in the business Moonlight and Magnolia, right? Where they're erasing the experience of slavery on these sites, having weddings at these sites, right? As a famous historian once said, you know, would you get married at Auschwitz, right? You wouldn't. That's an obvious answer. So why would you marry at these plantations? So I don't know that tourism is if it's taking a hit somewhere, I think it's making it up somewhere else. And that's only going to continue to improve.
Okay, and finally, can you speak to the document, A Measuring Rod for Textbooks?
I cannot. I'm sorry.
Yeah, Dr. Goldman, could you say a little bit more about that, please, in the chat, about that particular document? What is it exactly?
Actually, it was presented by the Daughters of the Confederacy in the early 1900s to the Sons of Confederate Veterans. And basically, it was a document put together by a woman, I forget her name, who actually listed some criteria for approval of textbooks that they suggested, which would glorify the South and deny some of the reasons. One of the big things was that slavery was not the cause of the Civil War. Another point was that the North initiated the hostilities, and there were several others that I just can't think of right now. But I think it was 1913 or 1918 when they adopted this, and it was shortly after Dunning had his American Historical Association meeting in Charleston, and they created what I guess has been known as the Dunning School, in which they painted Reconstruction as a totally negative experience, and they painted all the Black legislators as ignorant buffoons.
And the date you gave here predates, this is probably, you know, the historian Sims had written a history of South Carolina. His granddaughter is going to write the textbooks that fuel the state for about 50 or 60 years. So the timing of this document you mentioned is right before she starts doing this in the 1930s. So what this document is calling for, she ultimately just writes the textbook for it.
Okay.
All right. So I do want to go ahead now. Yes, I do want to go ahead now and move on to Dr. Brown's presentation. So after Dr. Brown is done, we will have time to go back to previous questions. No, Mari has a question in the chat, but I do want to get to Dr. Brown as soon as possible to give her ample time to give her presentation too. So we'll come back to Amari's question and then move on to a few others as well. So Dr. Brown, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. I don't think my presentation could be any more different from Jennifer's. When I talk with Brett and Robert about being with you this evening, I made it very clear that I really did not intend to do a lecture of sorts, because for me, deeper dive is what I've been about for the past several years, especially since my retirement from teaching. And that is this kind of urging people to ask the questions that don't normally come up, to take advantage of these kinds of settings, and get at, in my case anyway, some more personalized viewpoints, hopefully historically accurate, of course, but just to take a look at some of the problematic transitions that we've made in the name of social justice. And it's not to deny that we haven't made some, but it is also to say we have to be ever increasingly careful to not assume progress being made in arenas that if you do take a deeper dive, you'll see that maybe the progress hasn't been quite as much as you thought. I was born squarely in the middle of the 20th century. I was born in South Carolina, right when Governor Burns was very instrumental in getting funding to taxes to attempt to combat what was obviously coming forth as far as the demand for the end of segregated education. And so the tax increase that was proposed and ultimately passed, I think it was 2%, in the early 50s, was to equalize Black schools, because the NAACP had been working with it. We talk about the Briggs versus Elliott case. We know that in the 40s on into the 50s, we knew Brown versus Board of Ed was coming. You know, not everybody saw it as clearly, but the point was the challenge was ever growing. And so the efforts being made to improve Black schools very much has to be seen in that context. I make that point because not too long ago, I was giving a presentation to a group of Black graduates here in Charleston on James Island of what was known as Gresham Meggett High School. And these alums were very enthusiastic about honoring their equalization school, and got quite upset with me when I asked them to certainly be embracing and proud of the wonderful teachers that they had, the camaraderie that all of us, well, most of us remember from our childhood days and our schoolmates, you know, but to please understand that you got to put equalization in a broader context. And it was done to say, we will put more money into these South Carolina schools if it means we can continue to keep the schools segregated. And so I remember the era in the mid-50s very much, leading right up to Brown, because I attended a school where the textbooks came to us after white schools had used them for years, and the children had torn out pages and had written in them. And I remember the kinds of facilities we did not have. I went to a all-Black elementary school where the PTA had to raise the money to get a cafeteria because the public school system did not, you know, include one at our school. So I'm very sensitive when we talk about equalization, especially because as time has gone on, some of the negativity has not been there. And so now you have people saying, you know, oh, we went to the first Black school on James Island, and we're so happy for that experience. And we were then able to get a high school diploma. And of course, that's very true, but having to remind people of why those schools eventually were built is just a part of that ongoing debate and problem with, if we don't take the time to tell these stories very carefully, there's just this other kind of history that will advance. To speak a little bit more to that, we know that Brown versus Board of Ed, Topeka, Kansas, will take place, will be ruled in by 54, followed in 55 by Brown too. It is immediately after the Supreme Court decision that my parents and a number of other parents in Charleston put forth one of my older sisters to be the original plaintiff to try to desegregate Charleston High. I always make a point of saying, folks, do the math, okay? 1954, local parents or throughout the state, not just in Charleston, are trying to then make good on Brown. So they're going to the schools and trying to obtain transfer papers, because now that Brown has been decided, the assumption is, okay, then we just put in a transfer request, if you will. And that is when people like my parents found out that no, it just didn't work that way. South Carolina was adamant that it was not going to adhere to the Supreme Court decision. And so my sister, Minerva Brown, becomes a senior in high school. And I do understand this is true not just in South Carolina, that a spate of lawsuits then starts up, because it is then said that if a plaintiff to desegregate schools is no longer available, in her case, she's about to graduate, she is deemed moot. And so in this case, these were suits that were backed very much by the NAACP primarily throughout the South. The deeming these cases as moot then said, the case gets thrown out and you have to start the process all over again. And so you have to go through the courts, you have to go through the local courts, and then the state courts, you know. And it's all about the big case of Brown really just was going to be ignored. And as my sister graduated from high school, my father very jovially used to tell the story through the years that I was his ace up his sleeve because he had another daughter. And so we were able to find someone in the courthouse who then replaced Minerva Brown's name with Millicent Brown. I was in the 7th grade at the time, and the Brown versus Charleston County School Board District 20 is in my name, not my sister's name, because of that switch. But it stayed in my name for 3 years. We don't see school desegregation in South Carolina until 1963. I am now a 10th grader. And so I always try to, especially in terms of teaching students like Jennifer, to tell people, look at the dates, do the math, let us never talk about school desegregation happened in 1954 as a result of Brown versus Topeka, Kansas. And if we look at states throughout, we will see how long and hard it took various states to finally be forced to adhere to the Supreme Court case. I always called that the big Brown in Topeka, and I was the little Brown in South Carolina. 9 years later, 9 years, a whole decade went by. And I do think it's always important for people. I've been teaching this civil rights stuff for so many years to so many students, and I was in the classroom long enough to understand how inaccurately something, even that one event, was being conveyed to younger students, because then you got, well, there was Brown, and then there was King, and then there was, and just having to say, hold up a second, it didn't go quite that smoothly, folks. It took a lot more, and a Supreme Court decision and subsequent legislation, did not miraculously transform even that period we can consider a period of public access, especially in the Deep South. I will share with you that what I have been doing since my retirement in talking about the children who deseg schools, thousands of us all over this country. But I have been doing this very purposeful attempt to say, when we talk about the civil rights movement, it is important to make a distinction between desegging a golf course, a beach, a lunch counter, a theater, the things that we kind of compress into what civil rights struggles were about, certainly including access to the voting. But when you talk about school desegregation, you are talking about some of the most vulnerable people at the most vulnerable point of their human development. That's children. And so, Jennifer, not only are there not statues, for this phenomenon, but I think for many people unknowingly, there is also this scripting of, we just kind of throw school deseg into the pot of public access. And so I've been spending the last several years continuing to say to folks, we have got to understand that if any phenomenon like school desegregation had occurred, if thousands and thousands of white children had ever gone through some kind of phenomenon like that, I think good social scientists would have collected data. I believe that we would know more. We would know what happened to those children. What kind of career choices did they make? How many marriages and divorces did they have? And an array of other kinds of statistics that would say, guess what? Children being used on the front end of social justice struggles have to be acknowledged, have to be studied. Let's see what that impact was, not just on the schools, but on them. For me, that's the beginning in the modern day of Black Lives Mattering. And it is the lack of that data that has driven me for the past many years, because I do believe we lump sum school desegregation as a part of that broader civil rights struggle and forget the damage. I know that all of you are aware of a number of monographs and memoirs that have been written by children who we call first children, those of us who were some of the first Black students to go into schools. And I'm very careful to say that, number one, let's always, in talking about this phenomenon, remember that it depended on where you were, which state, which city. It was handled differently. And so there were multiple different experiences that children went through. There are many first children that will say that they have wonderful, fond recollections of having gone into these integrated settings, and they want no sympathy for it. And we must give them that it was a good experience for many people, and so be it. However, I do think that the longer time goes on, we are finding that more and more of us are willing to talk about the trauma not of the first day, like a Ruby Bridges or what happened in Little Rock, not just the confrontation with the police or the National Guards. That's a story certainly unto itself. I'm talking about human trauma day after day, month after month, year after year, of being marginalized and of being, as I often say, when you're not only not chosen to sit at the table in the lunchrooms, you're not only not asked to play games on the playground, there are those kinds of things. There's also, you don't get asked to lead groups. You don't get asked to be a prom queen. You don't ask to be part of those organizations that we think about, especially by the time we get to high school, as being the foundation of who we become as adults. And so I'm just always aware that what are the other questions we've not asked about what happened? What about the difference psychologically between what happened if you were at a third grade level versus an 8th grade or even a 10th or 11th? I personally struggled for years with an unbelievable sense of guilt because I did not know how to help the younger ones that were going to the school. Jackie Ford and I were the first 2 students to attend the same high school, but she was in the 8th grade. Think about it, folks. 8th graders don't talk to upperclassmen. It's just not done, And so I had this kind of adolescent thing about, I don't want to be seen talking with an 8th grader. That's not cool. But we are in this unique circumstance, and I've got to help her out in some way, and I didn't know how to do it. Then, of course, there was the fact that we didn't share classes. We didn't share the same recess. And so we were struggling on our own and didn't have a way to really connect and support each other. It's those kinds of issues that I spend time talking with folks about, just again, to humanize that youthful phenomenon that we kind of forget about and have a tendency to look at as saying, well, after the 60s, we move on. Ladies and gentlemen, why is that so important to me now? As a college professor, I was teaching in North Carolina. I think it was actually my first teaching position. And I was at an all-Black college, Bennett College. a wonderful, motivated, talented student of mine came up and said, Dr. Brown, when you tell us about having been in all Black schools and then what happened when you went into integrated schools, and these were her exact words, she said, we think ghetto. And I said, ghetto? What are you talking about? She and her peers were young enough. They were born in 1990 to 94, something like that. They had been taught that the reason for integrating schools was how deficient Black schools were and how inferior, and therefore had grown up understanding that the purpose of integration was to go to good schools, which meant attended by white people. And that if you go to a quality school, it's because it had white teachers. And my heart broke, and I talked with this young woman at great lengths. And from that day on, I forever changed the way I ever discussed school desegregation, because I had been making an assumption. I thought that folks understood, coming behind, teaching about the civil rights movement, that we were also teaching that we had come from wonderful, supportive Black schools. We were under-resourced. We had no money. We had, I never saw a locker until I went to the all-white school. I didn't have a good science lab. I mean, the books were really crappy. You know, the dearth of resources, financial, physical resources, had gotten embedded in the argument such that Black students were telling me, oh yeah, we had to integrate because that's the way to get out of inferior schooling. And all I can tell you folks is that it is why I have a lecture that I make available to colleges when I speak one-on-one like this, and also with some writing that I'm continuing to do. I have had to really engage people in how, if we don't teach the story correctly, we have just bought into a total white supremacist mindset. And we are seeing it today. All the middle-class Black folks who are rushing to get their children into the charter schools and into the advanced schools. Children who have the means, and parents have the means to do so. We don't ask about the children who don't have that and therefore are in community schools. But there's this wrangling with, do I tell children, get out of the community if you want high quality education? And so I, again, because of when I was born, I have this incredible knowledge of excellent Black teachers. And most of us around the South, throughout the country, we went to cruddy schools with excellent Black teachers. And that is the story that it has to be corrected, because otherwise we are continuing to tell children today, you gotta get out of your community. You got to send your child to this other school. You have to do the integration to be with white people if you want quality. And as much as I am a proponent and a supporter of integration, I mean, it's the only way that humanity is ever going to finally advance. My sister and many of my peers and other first children are more and more coming to the realization that We better really press for quality education in communities so that whoever is in school with you gets the same opportunity to be well educated. If we make integration be the point, the goal, we have done, I believe, a great disservice to all those children who can't move to another side of town, and for whom busing and closing their schools and their legacies and leaving Black teachers who love them because of who they are, we are doing a grave disservice. So I am called upon often as a first child because people assume that I'm pushing this integration thing. And I've had to just humble myself to say, my daddy did not put his beloved daughter into the crap that she had to put up with for those 3 years of high school, and did it so that he could see people now talk so disparagingly about what Black education was all about. It's a deeper dive, y'all, and it's a point that I hope I've raised some thoughts with you, just in terms of if we're not careful, we are passing some very inaccurate images out there, and we've got to correct them while we still can. I'll hold up on that and entertain any thoughts or questions if you like. I'm not hearing you, Robert. Robert, are you muted?
He is. Dr. Millicent Brown takes no prisoners and speaks truth to
Yeah,
power.
sorry about that. My mic was malfunctioning for a second, but that was a great presentation, Dr. Brown. We all really appreciate that because you hit on some really important points about how we teach history, about the importance of Black institutions, frankly. And as someone who's worked at one in the last few years in Claflin University, I've certainly seen this up close. I can tell you every year when I ask students, well, why did you decide to come to Claflin? Many of them tell me the exact same thing, which is in their K through 12 education, they attended predominantly white schools, and they have just never felt comfortable at those places. And they wanted to go somewhere where they could feel not only comfortable, but feel genuinely cared about as students and as human beings. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at the chat real quick. I'll just read some of the questions that are here for Dr. Brown. And again, if anyone also wants to take a stab at asking questions that combine the two topics this evening, please feel free to do so. Again, we'll be here until 8:30 tonight. So one question I see in the chat is talking again about the experience of students and such. But didn't that change when our Black teachers were sent to white schools? The best of our instructors were sent to the white schools, and we were sent their inferior and inexperienced white teachers. You're correct that up until then, we received a wonderful education. Do you have a response for that, Dr. Brown?
No, only to say that this broadening of our shared humanity, which I think has got to continue to be the goal that we all give our lives up to, we just have to understand that if we take our eye off the ball, you know, and we think that, okay, now that we have people being together, then we've somehow progressed as a human race. And so we just have to say, wait a minute now, what's the experience? What is happening with those students who believe that quality is found in these, you know, I'm going to go to Duke, I'm not going to go to Morehouse, I'm, you know, we just have to make sure that we are understanding that whether intentional or not, and in many cases, I think it is, of course, but I think in unintentional for many of us, we don't realize how we are buying into what white supremacy really is all about. And so teachers who love, you don't have to be Black to love a Black student, okay? But there is something about when you are taught by people who know you and have shared backgrounds and experiences. There is something about not buying into stereotypes. You know, when we talk about the prison pipeline, a lot of times that prison pipeline from schools is because of teachers, often white, who don't know how to manage classes, don't know how to handle a different cultural experience with children of color. And so they get thrown out disproportionately. And then, you know, so all these things are connected to, is there a fundamental respect and regard and love? And it's hard to teach that. You don't teach that in a teacher education program. You really don't. There's something a little bit more fundamental about respecting, and I believe that it can be done. I know many white teachers who have certainly shown that, but because we don't talk about it openly and we assume, then we run into these problems later with teachers who are afraid to discipline Black kids because they don't want to be seen as racist. And so you got some badass little boy getting away with murder because you were too afraid to check it and be the responsible adult in the room. You know, I mean, they're just all these ways that we just have to make sure we check ourselves to see, are we understanding the humanity of these children? And that we're not buying into they're poor, therefore they don't this, you know, or their parents don't love them. I hear that a lot, you know, the assumption that Black parents don't love their children as much. That's why they don't come to PTA meetings. You know, we just have to be very cautious of the assumptions that are made, that if you take a deeper dive, you'll see that no, this is just some stereotypical thinking, and we haven't challenged teachers enough to be able to do what they can do in those classroom settings.
All right, and another, I think, interesting question here, just following up on that one, is this. It should be noted that the original goal of many of these movements was full funding of Black schools, and the goal was perverted to quote unquote integration. I think referring to what we've talked about this evening and how integration was an incomplete at best process.
Right.
Why and how and what are the present day manifestations of some of the mistakes that have been made in terms of a not really full-throated process of integration, so to speak?
Number one, as I said, the part of the work that I will probably do for the rest of my life is recognizing what emotional and psychological impact it has on a child to be marginalized, stereotyped, relegated to some kind of other status. And so that's one mistake. We think that a child that should be so happy to be in this setting. We forget that, you know, we're not watching whether or not they are not performing well, or are we being respectful of the community from which they've come, you know, so that's one way. But beyond that, I think the worst desecration of community that is so needed for community building, economic, political, and everything, is this buying in that we as a community are an inferior people, and that our saving grace in America is to become a part of, and you know, and not understanding that, you know, America is going to hell if it doesn't get its act together. So for Black folks to look to white models and say, you know, I want to be a part of that, you know, it is important that we realize, you know, something, Everybody doesn't need to have a bachelor's degree. Higher education isn't for everybody. We have Black communities where we don't want our children to get their hands dirty anymore. So who is taking all the higher skilled crafts positions? It's not people of color anymore. So we have undermined our own communities because we've bought into an overestimation of what it means to be white collar. And so there are those ways, and that just makes it so hard to build communities, to get people to invest in their own communities and insist that the cities we live in take care of our streets the same way. We're too busy moving to the other part of town to a gated community. So it is an ongoing, devastating rebuke of being African descended. And it shows itself in every single avenue of life.
And I think that answers an interesting segue to our next question, which is, what are your thoughts on the segregation academies that are still operational today?
The all white segregation academies you're talking about? Yeah. Mm-hmm. I don't want my public money going to them. So this whole big, educational argument that we've been having about whether federal money could be sent to private schools or charter, so I don't want public money going to them. I regret that folks are still so afraid of people of color that they think they have to, still create these enclaves of whiteness, I mean, what can I say? I mean, I'm sorry. But I'm very quick to say, but please do not tell me that, and I see Vince Matthews just sent me a notice about something about Burke High School, or somebody saying about C.A. Johnson, don't tell me because everybody's Black that it can't be excellent. Because, I love that we all go together, but if we can't, and if we don't, let's not assume the inferiority, And as far as going back to the original question, I'm sorry if people still want to run away, I'm sorry, but I can't spend a whole lot of time worrying about that.
All right. And another, I think, interesting question. There are a lot of interesting comments in the chat as well that I think really sum up how important this topic of conversation really is. But one question that I see in the chat right now is, can you talk about how your parents prepared you? I would guess your parents knew what you were going up against. And a follow-up to that is, in hindsight, would you volunteer your child to be in the front if you were in their position?
I've been asked those questions often. Because of the uniqueness of my particular background, and several others of us you'll find that were first children, we didn't have much choice in the matter, but most of our parents were in fact involved in the civil rights movement. My father was local president of the NAACP from the mid-50s to 60, and then became state president from 60 to 65. And so I came up in an activist household, if you would. And did my father prepare me? Hell no. And I wondered about that. I've thought about it for many years. I remember when I was in the 7th grade and I became the chief plaintiff, I got taken down to the all-white male school board meeting where they just jumped on me for why did I want to leave my Black school? Wasn't I happy? Didn't I like my teachers? Didn't I like my friends? It was very intimidating for a 7th grader to have to go through that. And I was furious with my father afterwards because all he had done was tell my mother, dress her up nicely, we're going downtown. And he didn't tell me anything that I was about to, encounter. But in hindsight, having been around so many people like Matthew Perry and Ida Quincy Newman and Henri Monteith and Harvey Gantt and just so many other people, I realized, you know, those of us in the movement, be it the part of the movement with schools or anything else, we fundamentally understood the rightness and righteousness of our cause. We were doing something that had to be done. And so even when you run into these problems later and were confronted with negativity, you knew why you were doing what you were doing. Thus the name of my program, you know, my oral history project, Somebody Had to Do It. I did not let my son go to a predominantly white school when he was quite young. I could not do it. I remembered my experiences and he did not want to. And I will always struggle with whether his life would have gone differently. But I was literally incapable of putting my own child into a setting that I knew he did not want to go into, where I could not be sure that he was going to be treated sensitively. So that's just one of those issues that individual parents are still making for their children. But I think having these kinds of discussions and being more cautious, we are having to say, don't get caught up in what you think that school will do. Know your child, because some kids are a lot stronger than others and can handle stuff, are supported in other ways at home, you know. So if a parent decides that they're going to put their child into a setting, then they need to understand where's the backup support for that as well.
Oh, definitely. All right. And I think that that's an interesting way for us to think about another fascinating question in the chat. And I love these questions coming in this evening. I think if there's one thing the Modjeska School should be known for, it's getting great questions from the audience. This question is, how can today's generation honor and acknowledge what those before us survived, fought for, and won, while still navigating the challenges that still currently exist? I cringe when I hear my generation say, so what, when we are told folks died for us to have these rights.
I'm going to certainly, I don't want to take up and not give Jennifer a chance, you know, to get in on this. I have taken on a slogan that'll probably be on my gravestone, okay? And that is, we must teach each other, not just children, but each other. Stop taking crumbs and calling it a cake. If we could teach that this was an incremental step towards a greater goal, I think we get into the trouble, and why the young people kind of dismiss it is we tend to just make everything sound kind of wonderful and good and heroic and whatever, and they turn us off. I think we have to keep saying this struggle is long, it is hard, we are all in it for the long run. Stop fooling yourselves that because you made this little bit of progress that it solved the problem. That's just sort of the way I'm taking this on.
That's a very good point. And actually, Jen, if you want to jump in there and talk a bit about that from your perspective as someone who specializes in memorialization and such, please go ahead.
You know, part of it, going back to Dr. Brown's beginning, you know, part of it is the way we teach history. I remember one of my first projects when I was a master's student in Wilmington, North Carolina. Some of you undoubtedly know about the 1898 coup d'etat that took place there, the only known local coup d'etat in US history. And so that was my first project. And then I was working on the Wilmington 10 case, which, the National Civil rights organizations were commenting about this case. And it was essentially a case that revolved around kind of the shift of that sort of king narrative of the civil rights movement into more local work. Some might have been Black Panther parties in some communities. This was not necessarily the case in Wilmington. And I bring this up because 1968 is such a momentous year. And I remember interviewing people for these documentaries I was doing about the Wilmington 10. And the same year they're integrating, same story Dr. Brown told, right? They have one of the best Black high schools in the country, Williston High. One of the more famous people I can think of off the top of my head that graduated there was Althea Gibson, the tennis player. And they talked so much about what they lost when Brown v. Board and integration and all deliberate speed. I think someone in the chat had made a point about they wanted to try out for cheerleader and then didn't. I think it was maybe Beverly. Your story reminded me of this so much because when I was talking to people about the integration, they would say, this school was the number one under the sun. That was our motto. And they didn't get to transfer all their teachers. And even in things like cheerleading, they would talk about they would be given, speaking of crumbs as cake, they would be given one spot on the cheerleading team for a Black student to hold when they were coming into these white schools. And it was never on the table that Williston would be integrated as one of the best schools in general in the nation, but also certainly in this community. And the day King's killed in Memphis, that he was supposed to come through, I think, the Carolinas, and he was supposed to land in Wilmington. And they never got over this. The closing of their school, King's death on the day that he was supposed to come and bring some uplift at a time that had been really challenging. And they're still grappling with the trauma that Dr. Brown, talked about, wanting to praise this school. And so we've got to get part of that history out. I absolutely agree with that. My other issue is I try to talk as much as I can about segregationist academies and things like that to my white friends and family. So many people do not even understand really the long history of it. Some do, without a doubt. But here in Pittsburgh, for example, I teach with some really well-educated progressive people, but they're sending their kids to private school because of the school system here. And to me, that perpetuates the problem. If we don't decide we're going to go all in for public education, right. And part of that is on our responsibility, I think, also talking to the people we know that send their kids to these kind of academies.
I want to jump in and just share something with this group again, because you've been studying South Carolina. I was in junior high, again, this is all Black school. And because there was so many efforts being made to discourage Blacks from pushing for local school deseg, I guess it's part of the whole equalization thing. We had closed circuit classes. I think it was an advanced algebra and an advanced science class that was not available at my all Black school. It was closed television circuited into our classroom, taught by 2 white teachers. And a dear friend of mine who was in class with me at the time reminded me about this recently. We said the technology was there. This is 1960. And this is even before there was an ETV, but there was still closed caption. And so when anybody tells me that, as we're hearing now, that you have to close this school because it's not financially feasible, because we can't teach every level of French, at every school and blah, blah, blah. And I say, we knew in 1960 how to transmit teaching into classrooms where there, for some reason, were not the facilities to do it. And I was in the 7th and the 8th grade. And so when I see Lincoln High School in the Charleston area, Charleston County, be closed and those children taken, bused wherever into Wando, and the reason being we can't keep up all these schools. We have to close some of them, they aren't getting the same instruction. I'm saying we got the technology. The technology has been there for a long time. If we wanted to teach everybody well.
Yeah, I think that's another important point to really think about here. And to this point about how we teach these traumatic moments in our history is another great question in the chat. We are aware of epigenetics. We talk about it in terms of the trauma passed down to victims. But is racism, white supremacy, a trauma that is passed down generationally that explains the xenophobia, violence, and fear that we see so much today?
You know how people say Trump isn't the problem, he was only the symptom? Okay, we got to understand that that's what white supremacy and racism are. They get used to advance economic and social other kinds of issues. And I've spent my lifetime trying to disentangle. And I'm not somebody that doesn't believe that racism is quite real and a trauma, past and white supremacy for sure. But the truth is, are there not greater, stronger economic forces, capitalist forces that have a global agenda? And racism continues and white supremacy continues to be used to advance these other agendas. That's where I am in my thinking at this time. But it will take a long time to undo it. And I certainly have no answers, but I think we have to keep struggling to teach that it isn't really about race. It really isn't. It is how we use that as a divider to keep people separated and from working to define what a real global human society could possibly look like. It's the big excuse.
Yeah. Amari asked a couple great questions across today. And, earlier, there was a book I was thinking about, because we've had several questions too, like, why aren't other people building? What's stopping them? There's a great book by Dale Upton called What Can and Can Be Said. And it's really about Black memorialization on the landscape and the challenges that have come with that. And how long it took to get that, and then what narrative do you tell, right, once you finally get access to the public sphere to tell these stories. And so I think we're still grappling with this and how to do this effectively and how to get the support across the board. So whether it's private or public land, there's so much community buy-in today that you are navigating. Thanks, Dr. Green. That they're navigating today to get this work done that just didn't simply exist when the Daughters of the Confederacy are doing this. So I did want to recommend that as you all are thinking a little bit about who else is trying to commemorate and what does that look like.
Definitely. Thanks so much for that. That's a great book that I will add to my reading list that is already way too long. All right. So another question here. I think both of you could probably tackle this one as well. How terrifying was it to see empathetic alliances like the alliance of the Panthers, the Young Patriots, the Young Lords, etc., or the marginalized or even clergy across faith denominations, race historically? So thinking about how you had these multiracial alliances and coalitions being built in the past, how terrifying were those for back then? And how do you think intersectionality today can have the same potency in terms of building alliances? Do white Americans still have the same backlash or face the same backlash for reaching out across the construct of race and division?
I can say in the case of the Wilmington 10, there was one white woman that was arrested as part of that case. I do believe she was one of the first ones released, but in the interview I did with Reverend Ben Chavis Muhammad said that he was certain without a doubt that the only reason she was arrested with those 10, and there were more than 10 arrested, they eventually went to trial, was simply because she was a white woman that was doing this kind of work with the Black community. And in the same way, they had a white priest that came in and, when violent mobs came into the community, it was the church and that guy that offered shelter. So yeah, I think they paid for that, certainly in the time period. For me, I'm a Xer with millennial leanings. So I'm trapped in this analog and digital world, which I say that because I grew up not understanding anything about the race relations around me. And that's part of the reason I pursued history. What I find today is people are not as surprised that I engage in work like Black Lives Matter or go to protests or whatever I may be doing. It's, I wouldn't even, it's bigger than a microaggression, but even still from my family, it's like, oh, Jen doing that stuff, right? There's this kind of sense that you don't have to be a part of it to bring about change. There's other people doing it. And I find it offensive, but all you can do is chip away at those kinds of people in your life when you're doing it. So I hope that it's getting better and that there's a moment for intersectional, but we know white women and white feminism has done some pretty gnarly things. So, it has to be welcomed. I think that's the challenge too, not to be the loudest voice in the room. And with that, I'll defer to Dr. Brown.
I'll make this short. I have great hope in this whole idea of intersectionality. But I take it from my one-on-one day-to-day encounters with people who say they're allies. And I'm constantly having to either remind or be reminded that if you can't ever move over and let people, however they identified, if we're talking about African Americans or any other group, if we constantly get used to push your agenda, that's not intersectionality. I mean, there is this fundamental need to understand what empowerment really is. And I run into it again. I tend to get less and less theoretical with it, and I just kind of deal with it smack in my face when I know that someone says they are on my side, but don't listen to any suggestions that I ever give. And this idea of doing for, and this inability to see in themselves that you seem to like being with Black folks when we're sort of on the bottom. But when we don't seem to need your approval, or don't seem to, that you can't seem to make room, that maybe you don't know it all. It's just an arrogance. And that's something I think that we see broadly with institutions. We see it on committees. We see it on commissions. We see it, it's that one-on-one, meeting by meeting, campaign by campaign. And so I don't spend a lot of time. I mean, my mind is open that we have to work on struggle and overcoming what we know has to change in this world. But I think we're still so blinded by ways in which we don't respect the other. You know, we still have this sense that there is a correct way, and you're going to help some folks come into that correctness, and so I back out. I back out of organizations because I find that very often I'm just not on the same page with people, because they kind of want me in my weakness and my vulnerability, but they don't seem to want me in my strength. And so for that, I have concerns, but we will have to be honest and keep pushing that out there and calling people on it, you know, calling people on it. I see Fia Wangaza was putting something in the chat. A dear friend and mentor of mine, and someone who has helped me struggle for years. Fia, can you, Robert, can you see what her comment was?
Let's see. There are a few.
She was saying something about the Atlanta Project, and then it went away.
Oh yeah, it's at the very bottom. It says the Atlanta Project statement. The SNCC Atlanta Project's Black Power statement was not an official SNCC statement.
Okay, I'm not quite sure what she's getting at with that. Can she come on?
Well, actually, you know, since I think that we're at 8:18, we've got a few minutes left, and the questions are kind of drying up just a bit. I think we can go ahead and allow a few more folks to just speak up briefly. I know Keith has had his hand up for a few minutes, and I want to get Afia to also talk a bit more about the SNCC statement. So Keith, go ahead, please.
Thank you. I have experienced the pushback from reaching out. I was almost 30 years ago, I was the union training director for a sheet metal apprenticeship program. And I, having decades before worked with a roofing crew in this Florida summer, had a great deal of respect for what these people that I had had no experience even being with in school, because it was still segregated. I'm 72 years old, so I didn't have a Black classmate until I was in college. But I was so impressed with the fact they worked just as hard as me that I wanted to give the younger generation an opportunity of the crafts. And there was a lot of pushback. And I'm not so sure that's all gone away yet. But we keep fighting. Thank you.
I totally agree with you there. And Afia, did you want to go ahead? Okay. Okay. So yeah, she wrote in the chat some more. The Atlanta Project paper was but the germ from which Black Power emerged. That's what she was kind of pointing out there, and the importance of the Atlanta SNCC chapter to some of these larger conversations we're having this evening.
And when SNCC had to have that serious confrontation with, you know, what does it mean to have white allies, you know, and this whole notion of, if we are not comfortable with our own sense of empowerment and the insistence on it, and the faith that we had, that we understood all of the problems of society, both domestically and internationally. And we were schooled and we were searching, but there had to be this respect for our ability to do that. And that is one of the beauties of the Atlanta Project. And ultimately, when I joined SNCC and just had to understand, we need allies for sure. I think some of the language now is about, you know, we need more anti-racist, you know, and the idea of, what does that mean? Does it mean like in Charleston, where folks want to show where they are on the political spectrum, by going to Black churches, as a kind of a show that, we can be together, and we just have to say to people, your physical presence is one thing, but it's your politics, it's what you do when you go home, it's the decisions you make about where you send your children to school, it's how you treat people, it's your ability to not assume that your perspective is in fact the right one, all of that. And people found and continue to find that we have to insist that there is an underlying disregard and disrespect for whether Black folks really are capable of answering some of these severe questions that confront them very differently. Yeah, and always will.
All right, and Harold, I see that you have a question as well. Could you go ahead and ask your question, please?
Yes, Dr. Brown, thank you for all that you do. But I just wanted to ask you the irony of Representative Albert Rush, who we know that was a born slave that went into the General Assembly after the Civil War in 1868, who passed a free public education for all bill in South Carolina. And it seems like we've been in that battle, in that fight, ever since a born slave passed the Free and Public Education Act in South Carolina. And I just wanted to get your irony, since a lot of what you've weaved in and out, your perspective. I just wanted to hear you comment on that.
Yeah, I think there's an irony for us, but then if you think about it, the idea that those who had suffered the most in this part of the world and wanted so dearly to be seen as human again, and that little window of Reconstruction, was a time to try to work towards some kind of regained humanity. These are the people who always defined the human race, the reaction during and even after Reconstruction, even all the way into the 20th century, when we talk about the Black Power movement, whatever, we talk about the Panthers, was not to go down and burn down white folks' homes. There just never has been, coming out of the Black experience, this need for that kind of revenge. It's been kind of an open door that we have a vision of inclusion. And that is what I find problematic, that we don't talk about how Black folks, not just in Reconstruction, but forever, we've always set that broader table and in our struggle. And so, yes, there's an irony to that, but to that history, but it's part of that miseducation again. It is not because I'm ready to say we are a better group of people. I am saying, however, our history documents that we seem to always want to be expanding. And I tried to say to the superintendent of education here in Charleston County a number of years ago, we're struggling with public ed. Do you understand what it would mean if you as superintendent were to choose Avery Institute, an all-Black institution that survived for almost 100 years and produced some of the stellar leaders of Reconstruction and thereafter? If you use that as your model, because, and my father was a graduate of Avery Institute, he would show, now you see that room there? That's where I took my carpentry class. And then he would point and he'd say, but you see the third floor up there? That's where we learned Greek and Latin. And under this one roof, out of that experience, we understood the nobility of different people's talents and work. And some are going to go on and be doctors and lawyers and judges and blah, blah, blah. And others are going to be fine craftspeople and whatever. But Avery understood that you can respect all of those varying talents of people, and that you don't have to relegate, it's the ones that get to go to college, that they're the better people or whatever it is. And I begged Dr. Postlethwaite, use Avery as your example of how we include technical education and respect all the varying skill levels. Use it. And you would also do a service, because you would have taught your community that, oh my goodness, it was an all-Black school that set that model of excellence. I believe in those kinds of examples being used, and that we can possibly re-educate, if you will, but we just have to make sure we understand, if we're not careful, that kind of history will get dismissed and marginalized. And it comes down to, we don't believe in Black intelligence.
Yes,
All
ma'am.
right, so we do have to, we're actually just about out of time, unfortunately. I do want to thank Doctors Brown and Taylor for some really incredibly informative lectures this evening that, again, have not only tied to what we've discussed so far in this class, but tied to some future discussions we're going to have as well in the Modjeska School. So I thank both of you for coming with us tonight. I know giving up a Monday evening is not the easiest thing in the world. I know we're all pretty busy, but I appreciate you guys giving a lecture tonight. And I appreciate everyone coming in this evening to share with us some incredible conversation this evening. So Brett, take it away, please.
Well, thank you, Robert. And Dr. Brown and Dr. Taylor are manifestations of the type of resources that we're bringing to the table. And this Modjeska School project is something that we need everyone's help with to make sure it goes on beyond those of us that were alive that knew the lady, and the work that she did, and the work that still needs to be done, that Millicent so appropriately touched on, that this is the process. It's not an end game. It doesn't stop. And I want to invite, there are a number of people on here tonight that I haven't seen in some time. And we opened our deeper dive to the people outside the class. And we want to let you know that on April 26th, it follows our next class, the April 4th class, which picks up with 1946. Our classes run like the people's history runs in eras. And we lift up significant events that happen in the eras. We try not to be a history class. We're a class about resistance and oppression, and how we learn from that to be able to use the history to make our present better and our future much better. And so the class that comes up next is about the time of 1946, when the Southern Negro Youth Congress was one of the most amazing things I've ever known about. And my 50 years of being in South Carolina as an activist and a self-professed revolutionary. Why didn't I know about that? And so we'll talk about that. But on the next Monday, on April 26th, Eric Gelman is our guest lecturer. And Gelman wrote the first book that was ever written about the Southern Negro Youth Congress, the National Negro Youth Congress, that just the history of it's just been completely obliterated. And so I want to invite everybody that's not a Modjeska School student to make that note and let us know. Send us an email. We'll make sure that you know about it, to participate in the April 26th thing. And so much of what, like, Dr. Brown, like, opened this window of this reality that she experienced, that we as we go through the class in the Modjeska School, we add understanding from different angles. She talked about the Segregation Academies. We've had Tom Turnipseed as one of our guest presenters. And Tom's like the most out, Tom passed just recently, but he was just the most out anti-racist who had been a racist, who was George Wallace's campaign manager, who came to South Carolina in 1960, I think it might have been 3 or 4, with the purpose of starting segregation academies. It started like 36 in a year. And what we found out in looking at it is the segregation academies still exist in the majority Black counties. And they're charter schools now, and people don't understand where they came from. And so this is connecting the dots of the history and the kind of the embedded racism that's become so familiar that we don't recognize it, that we lift up and expose. So I want to appreciate everybody being here, and thank you so much for Dr. Taylor and Dr. Brown contributing all your, just sharing yourselves with us. And wanted to say that you can leave now, but those of you that want to stay and chat a little bit, we open the mic. We normally would play some kind of music or something here, but get a glass of wine, a soda, or whatever it is. Let the folks that need to go. And Marjorie Hammock is sharing her wine with us. Pour it in your computer, Marjorie. And that we've got some really wonderful people here. And one of the downsides of this virtual stuff is that when we finished the Modjeska School in the past, we hung out and talked. We had, cake and cake and tea, and the conviviality of building this community of shared values that Dr. King called the beloved community. If we don't do that, we can't win this fight. And so we've got to build that community, and that's really part of what we're all about. And so I want to thank everybody for coming. Stay tuned, and let's take a break. And you're all excused. And Harold Mitchell's going to stay and talk to us. And so will some other people. But let those all need to go. Those who need to go to the bathroom, go. Those who need to refresh your beverage, go. And come back here in a couple of minutes and let's chat. Okay? Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me too. Enjoyed
Thank
meeting you all.
Thank you. And we'll see you again.
Okay.
And thank you, Jennifer.
You'll never find.
Yeah, Amari, sing something while I get a beer.
No matter where you search, someone who cares about you, the way that I do. That's all you get. Album in stores next week at the next class. Thank you very much.
Why not a full song?
Progressive Network Records, we in the building.
Hi, everybody. My name is Dr. Lisa Williams, and I just want y'all to say that I have so enjoyed coming on here every week and listening to this and learning from this. And I am a family nurse practitioner. I have a doctorate, graduated from the University of South Carolina. I want to say that my journey, I was born and raised in South Carolina, and my journey has been one of growth and learning and dealing with a lot of different microaggressions in my field as a doctorally prepared African American woman, kind of being always put in my place, always, I get, without them saying to me, it's been like directly, it's been like, okay, now you need to stay in your lane. And so one of the things that I have struggled with is always having to chip a little bit off of myself or who I really am every time I walk into a room to either present or lecture, always being looked at as if I get the higher position that, okay, I must have gotten it through, some kind of special, I was a token of some kind, or if I don't get the higher position, I'm training someone who has less experience than me, who has not the credentials that I have, who doesn't have the expertise that I have to do a job that's above me. I'm from a generation of children, that middle generation right now called Generation X that nobody thinks about. There's the millennials and there's the boomers. But us in Generation X, we started school in about 1976, 1975, and the segregation was over. We went to school with everybody, and in some areas, and we were actually being taught by teachers who didn't really want us there, but we didn't know that. And hindsight is always 2020 when you learn these things, but a lot we were not taught. The history books glazed over things. They didn't teach us things. So we were raised in a life thinking everything was beautiful. That was us. Everything was beautiful, but it wasn't until we became adults that we started to experience these microaggressions in society. It's been difficult. And so now we're getting towards the being the older generation in our 40s, and we are still struggling with that. We have the credentials, we have the experience. For example, I've been in nursing 29 years. When I was in my 20th year of nursing, I had the dean say to me at 40 years old, "You're amazing. I can't wait to see you in 20 years." Well, do I have to be 60 to be, where everyone else is who's in their 40s? And so that's been a struggle, and we don't talk about those kind of things much, but they're right there in our face. If you go in the colleges of nursing, if you go in these places, you don't see people like me in deanships. You don't see people like, and there's a lot of them that are qualified. You don't see people like me in the lead positions, and there's a lot of them are qualified. There's still a lack of access to nursing schools for African Americans. And so it's a lot of little microaggressions out there that affect me and my career, and affect me not even just in my career, just in every day. One of the things I'm working on now is the COVID initiative. And there was a lack of access to African Americans, and the hesitancy was being used as an excuse. But when we did the data and we looked at the research, it was just access was the issue. No cell phones, no email addresses, access to registration, access to broadband, so that's the kind of thing I wanted to share with the group. That's all.
Well, thank you, Dr. Williams. Delane, I don't know whether is Delane in there. You got your hand up, Delane.
Yeah, it's me. It's Delane. That was that was your name?
I'm sorry, I can't.
Where'd you go?
Yeah, you just spoke. The nurse. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm a baby. And you talking?
I can't.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. That, and what you were saying is so true. It's just kind of if I
Delana, we're having a hard time hearing you. No, we can't hear anything.
Can y'all hear me now?
Oh yeah. Oh
Okay.
yeah.
And one of the saddest things, I used to roll my eyes, but when you hear young people say, you ask them, have you ever been discriminated against, or do you know anyone who's ever been discriminated against? And they say no. And I'm saying, there's no way you can grow up Black, I don't care what year it is, and not know someone or haven't experienced yourself. But I think some of it is the history. I think we have a lost generation, I say, that doesn't, that didn't learn their history or thought the little strides, some of the strides, we have made strides, but they feel that they have arrived. And so they haven't experienced some of the things that we went through. And, it's just sad when you have a generation, or a lot of people who just walk through life and don't even recognize when they are being treated differently. And I'm not glad that the nurse, I'm not glad that you're being discriminated against, but I'm glad that you at least you recognize it. And I wish more people would recognize it and do things about it.
Thank you, Delana. And Delana is I call them the Farson sisters for a good reason. They've been just an incredible force for social justice in South Carolina since they were children. And really proud to have them on board. Want to recognize Marjorie Hammock and Carol Singletary and Amari Fox are co-chairs of our organization. And we're trying. We believe that the victory is in the effort, not necessarily in the attainment. We're doing what we can. Harold Mitchell, say something to us, brother. Tell us what's happening in Spartanburg.
Hey, sir, in the beginning, I thought my phone was or my laptop was muted when I blurted your name out. I'm not going to tell you who I was talking to, but I blurted your name and looked down at the screen and realized that I was not muted. So you didn't really have to call me out that way, sir. I was not going to go on, but I appreciate all that you and Becky, continue to do to have these conversations, to educate. And I mean, it's always with substance to make people think. And that's one of the things we had two people that were on from Spartanburg, and I think Angela Edwards is still on, that we have tried to, where no folks have tried to hijack the network and this whole thing about the redistricting conversations that are going on right now, and listening to folks around the state and what you talked about back then, and even after the 2013 Supreme Court decision, how we knew the handwriting on the wall of what was going to be now. And you would be surprised of the people that are in these conversations telling us what we can do and how we're going to be able to fight to make a difference when the die is cast. And it's like, needing to hear from you now, sir, the next step strategy that the network, what direction you're moving in right now, because I know some of these seats may be lost, our Democratic seats, where we have some members that have to gain 15,000 people in those particular districts that we're going to lose. So I just wanted to kind of hear from you what the network is doing in this regards.
Thank you, Harold. Let me tell you that Harold Mitchell came to my attention, I think in 1994. Joe Neal was elected in 92. And Joe told me, you need to talk to this young man, come back home from college. Then he's been sick and his family's sick and they live across the street from a toxic waste dump. And I interviewed this young man named Harold Mitchell. And many years later, here comes this guy from Spartanburg in the House of Representatives of South Carolina, Harold Mitchell. And so Harold and I go way back. But Harold, what the whole situation that we've approached redistricting with is the question of democracy. The protection of safe seats for what we now see as incumbents for both parties. But what it's done is it's created Bantustans and it's put black people in these limited number of seats that they can hold. So those of us that love democracy, and I'm including many of our black citizens, are cast as a minority, and we can't get over that, even though we have ideas that the majority supports. And so this artificial circumstance of the parties that George Washington warned us about, he said, don't create parties. You're going to end up with two that fight amongst themselves for money and power. That we've got to have a nonpartisan approach to the question of democracy, because most of us need the same things. And so Gilda Cobb Hunter, we worked with her in 2010, and the only maps that were presented for the new congressional district that had no majority black districts. And people go, whoa, what's up with that? It had two that were very competitive, and one that was on the edge of being competitive. And so if we reorganize things, we could actually increase the impact and the value of black votes. Right now, because black voters are packed into districts to maximize white votes, the black votes decrease in impact. And so you remember the 3/5 compromise at the South Carolina delegation to the Constitutional Convention in 1786. The 3/5 compromise was to count enslaved people as 3/5 humans in order to have the South participate in making the country. And that what we find now, if we count the number of black votes that are diminished by packing people into districts, the black vote in South Carolina is worth 3/5. Nothing's changed. And so our approach to the redistricting is to not look at safe districts, not rearrange the deck chairs on a losing ship, but to try and encourage and rejuvenate the 500,000 black voters that aren't participating in politics to look at the only district that can't be gerrymandered statewide. And the reason that we have a circumstance in South Carolina that is so institutionally racist is because in 1895, when Ben Tillman wrote the Constitution, it was designed to disempower people of color. there were more people of color than there were white people. And so they were afraid they could lose a statewide race. And so they devolved all the power of the legislature. We have the least powerful governor in the nation. But guess what? That means that there are enough black voters that are registered, 500,000 that aren't voting, that if we can convince them that it does some good to vote smart instead of voting for somebody that has a safe district, that the governor, the secretary of education, and the attorney general of the state of this South Carolina have all won the last 12 years, 3 elections for 12 years by 170 something thousand votes. 500,000 black people staying home because voting doesn't do any good. So that's what we're working on going into the redistricting. We're going to be working with different groups like SONG with Robert John here, who's on us with tonight, to try and get your organizations in Spartanburg to define their own community's interest. We've lost Section 5. Section 5 allowed us to raise hell before the maps were drawn. It's gone. Section 2 only allows us to raise hell after we're screwed. And so what we want to do is to engage the communities in identifying their communities of interest, as opposed to the legislators, black and white, that say, I want my community to look like this so I can pick my voters. That's not what it's about. Politicians shouldn't pick their voters. And so we've got a really good plan. And this Wednesday, we're introducing legislation that Vince Matthews, who's not with us right now, but Vince is our policy guy that's been working with us for a while. And he and I developed the legislation we introduced in 2018 for the Fair Maps Plan. And Wednesday, we're going to introduce the Fair Act. And that is actually the first laws governing redistricting. South Carolina is the only state in the nation that has no laws governing redistricting. And so we leave it up to the House and the Senate to make their own rules. And trust me, we're going to get screwed. No matter who wins, we're going to lose. And so Vince has taken the House and Senate rules and makes them laws and gives them back to y'all. Vote on your rules to make them laws, okay? And if they don't do it, I mean, obviously we can shame them if they're shameable to the fact that they don't even want any rules to be regulated by. But we want to see a deliberative process before the maps are drawn. And so that's our game plan now. We're going to raise hell in order to be able to try and move towards the 22 election, giving the people of good-hearted democracy, and that includes the voters of color that aren't voting, the understanding that we can make a difference in statewide elections that aren't rigged. And so that will contribute to our strength. And I went on for a while there, Harold, but I think that's something you needed to know.
Yeah, but Brett, can you do me one favor though? You and Jennifer?
Probably.
That racist Ben Tillman. Will y'all call him by his real name,
Pitchfork?
Yeah. Quit calling him Ben Tillman. Hell, he was Pitchfork Tillman.
I've never figured out. I saw you ask a question in the chat about why they call him Pitchfork, and I've got the book on him, and it doesn't really answer the question. He was like an agrarian, a populist, and I think that's where the Pitchfork thing came from.
No, it was his.
Tell us, Harold.
You know good and darn well it was his dislike for the Negro that went against him. He drove his pitchfork through everyone that rebelled against him. That's how he got the name Pitchfork.
I believe it. He bragged about killing people.
That's right.
Yeah.
And he said that if it took putting a pitchfork through him to suppress him, he'd do it in an instant.
Thank you, Keith. Thank you, Keith. That's 2-1. I agree. Harold, you win.
Thank you, sir.
So I read the material. I read the material.
Thank you, Keith. Omar.
I had a little challenge and love to my friend Dr. Billings about the undocumented and unheard voice. I know that you do a lot of work around with the immigrant community. So just any wisdom you could offer, and then this is an open question to the floor. Just trying to be mindful of all of our alliances in the circle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, since you posted that, I've been listening, right, to the conversation, but also thinking about that question. I mean, I think back to maybe it was the first class, the second class, the first class, when we were talking about sort of the history of Native Americans here in South Carolina and dispossession and such. And feeling like I want to include in these discussions the full sort of diversity of people in South Carolina. So South Carolina, at least when we moved here in 2007, had the highest rate of growth, the highest growth rate of the Latino and mostly undocumented population in the whole US. And that is a community that is a diverse community. It's not, people are from lots of different places, but it's certainly one that's been silenced and lives in fear in a lot of ways, right? Because of the immigration policies, am I gonna, as I cross a county line, which isn't even clearly demarked, is the sheriff in one county complicit with 287G versus in the next county, where I can get pulled over because my taillight is out and then end up in detention, some detention center in rural Georgia. So there's just a lot of fear and mistrust. A lot of the work that I do is on maternal health, and the fact that for, again, like 12 years through a statewide initiative, the Birth Outcomes Initiative, we've been trying to get sort of systematic access for women who are undocumented, access to prenatal care. And there are a lot of splintered efforts, and emergency Medicaid comes into play, but that's just when women are giving birth. And it's and so at one point we put forth some legislation that didn't get taken up, but it was basically modeled after some other states that said, okay, take care of the woman because the baby is going to be a US citizen. And that didn't even pass here in South Carolina.
Yeah.
It's like, even when you sort of frame women as the vessels, right, of future US citizens, that just didn't even fly. So might seem like I'm going off topic here a little bit, but I feel like we've got this large and growing population that in the time of COVID is definitely part of the frontline essential workers, right? Yeah. And they pick our food, and they they construct our buildings, they keep houses clean, they keep the buildings clean, just so many different things, and yet they can't even get access to prenatal care in an easy. People find ways, but it shouldn't be a search for finding ways, right? Or we don't have. My son goes to Dreher High School, and I'm on the school improvement council, and I've said in our annual report, we need to say the demographics are broken down as white, Black, and other. And I've said, can we please break down the other and actually name people? There are a lot of people who are in that other category that want to be seen, not as other. But just even the notifications that go out by the principal, I've said, send them to me and I'll translate them into Spanish. It's just these really, really, really basic kinds of issues that keep people really marginalized and really invisible when they don't want to be, but that's their reality out of fear. And I'll just say that the fear is super real. I mean, every week, twice a week, I answer a hotline for people calling from Stewart Detention Center in Georgia and their family members. And, one day people were going to their job, and all of a sudden the police pulled them over, and they're in a detention center in rural Georgia, where nobody even knows that this place exists, right? So anyhow, I'm going on and on. I just feel like there's so much a part of our state and the dynamics, and I want to figure out ways to kind of have their voices be heard as well.
And we count on you going on and on, Deborah.
Sorry.
It's really important for you to go on and on. Thank you, Dr. Billings. We want to wrap this up, or somebody will keep talking all night, but I want to see some hands, and we're going to get everybody that needs to say something to say something. Jane?
Brett, I just wanted to say, as a New Yorker this is my first year in South Carolina, one thing I have noticed about the Latino community, they are not accepted by the Black community. They are used for their labor, but they are not part of the Black community. They do not connect to the Black community. I don't know why, and I'm not pointing blame to anybody. I'm just making an observation.
I think there's plenty of blame. Robert John, speak to that. The question of the playing the Black and the brown off against each other, who does that benefit? That's what Gene's talking about. Why is that happening in South Carolina?
It's different here? Yeah, it's different here than in New York. Yeah.
And in Pennsylvania, yeah, it is different.
Yeah.
So I would say that what we start talking about is how divide and conquer politics starts to play into the ways that we start to organize or how we start living lives. So we go into this oppression of Olympics, this idea that if folks are coming in, they're going to take things from you. I have done these things from you, white power structure. I have already done these things. Look, I've delivered you from all this. Now they're going to come in, they're going to hurt you. That is in a way to distort what is actually happening about how capitalism is used to define bodies, how Black bodies are stolen to create an empire, then told that you can't have any part of that empire. And a lot of these people are not coming in from it. Also, misunderstanding. We go back to our first class. We know that indigenous people, as most Latinx folks are of the indigenous people, the people from the sun, that we have already been on these lands. We have been traversing back and forth. We've had treaties and relationships. We can know that people from Central Mexico had already been in Camden, South Carolina, before Europeans even were here. So we have already had these deeper relationships on this earth, on Turtle Island. So what happens is, in order for white people to become native, for order for white people to be the true Americans, there has to be a disenfranchisement, right? There has to be a broken away of. And so if too many of color folks are getting together and start talking about power structures, that scares white people. That's why there's always been ways to keep separations, always been ways to create other ways of how we are to not love or be around one another. So I think when we start looking at it, we're looking at the root of what white oppression looks like. And we always talk about white supremacy, but that also puts white people at a pedestal. It's a white oppression. It is an oppression that they utilize upon us to keep a status quo. And that happens in all dynamics of white space, in queer white space, gay white space, in professional white space. And it is there to hold a status quo. So when we're looking at those power structures and we're looking at those relationships, being mindful that that situation wasn't created by you or I. That was created by already a patriarchal racist system that I'm trying to abolish as an abolitionist, so that we can reconstruct a real self, a true self, a self on hollow ground, a self that recognizes all our bodies and labors. And that is part of that struggle. And so that's how I see it. And it's been played out in all various ways. It's the same way with Latinx and Asian people in, Crenshaw and LA, right? It's the same way it has been around Filipinos and Japanese in the Southwest. So there are many ways of how white supremacy falls into place, how that white oppression is utilized to create divide and conquer politics. And that's part of our goal as we try to think about unification, as we start to think about what does it mean to move forward, what does it mean to be a unified people, is we have to learn. And being together doesn't mean that we lose our self of identity. I want you to come with all your broken pieces, with all yourself, with all your bodies. I don't want you to be vanilla and structured. I want you to be kinky. I want you to have your whole self. I want your whole holistic self to come into play. And that's how we grow, and that's how we learn, and that's how we're able to move from where we're at and going even further. Like gerrymandering is part of that. It is part of how they're using a policy tool to divide and conquer us, to keep us separated, keep us placated in maybe one or two districts, right? So part of it is we're thinking about it, is liberation in our lifetime, because that's what I'm fighting for, is that we have to deconstruct the system. And we can do it in ways that have already existed. We have models of Black and brown people already organizing, creating communities. That's not fantastical, that is real. And we can utilize those skills, and we can do that work to be able to have sustainable relationships. We protect ourselves. We can build ourselves. We've always done that, except we were told that we shouldn't anymore because of respectable politics. We shouldn't be in these communities. We shouldn't be in these schools. You know, I was blessed to go to St. Andrews Middle School in Columbia High, the high, to have an education by Black teachers with Black students that was supported and helped me become the organizer and the revolutionary that I want to become, because I was around people who were already doing it, who are throwing down. So I want that for all, and we can have that. We can all, and everybody participates. I want white kids to learn Swahili. I want Black children to learn Mandarin. I want all of us, because in that experience, in that space, you bring so much of your kaleidoscope self into this world. Nobody can stop you. You become invincible. And that's the fear. That's the fear that their children are going to have to compete with my children, and their children won't have nepotism or cronyism because I want a more equitable playing field. So that's part of it. And I think being really conscientious of how it looks like, and we've had a history, Latinx people has been in South Carolina since there was a revolution. So there's been a history just also connected with indigenous folks, as our history with Black folks, that gets erased, they get silenced. And that's part of what this conversation is about, reintroducing the historical context of what is true, what is the real experience of South Carolina. So that's my little 2 bits.
This is why the Modjeska School learns from the students. And Jean, I hope that answered your question and then some. Thank you, Robert John. Anybody want to take something here to go home on? Robert John, thank you so much. You're right.
I have a quick question for Robert John. Star,
go for it.
So
Star, tell us where you're from. You're not
Spartanburg, South Carolina.
Well, that's okay. We like you.
Thank you. So my question is, and maybe this is just to everyone, but do you think that it's generational? So what I see now, because I have a 21-year-old and I work with college students, I work at USC Upstate, and I see more of the acceptance and working together and, combining efforts together towards social justice movements, things like that, among Latinos, and as well as African Americans and other cultures. So my question is, do you think it's more of a generational issue or thing when maybe our friend from New York is seeing something different? Because I've experienced more like what my friend from New York was saying, just from my experiences, but I'm seeing something different at the college level. But that's one local area, so I don't know how it is across the spectrum, across different locations.
And no different races and races. I live in Columbia, so I am not sure what it is around across South Carolina. But the South Carolina experience here seems to be behind the New York experience. And I think that's because in New York, there is a more, what's the word you use? Something or other. Well, all the races connect because it's
intersectional.
Yes, and so that we are meet with each other, talk with each other, have the same experiences in a more confined space. So we have to deal with the same problems the same way. We didn't always have that. But as the years from the 1960s on, that gives away my age, but from the 1960s on, like Harlem, for example, in Spanish Harlem was like the place to go for a particular thing, but you didn't go there because there were Spanish gangs. But now Spanish Harlem is no longer Spanish Harlem. It's become gentrified. So the Spanish people have gone elsewhere. They're in Queens, they're all over New York. So I think New York's experience is a little beyond the South Carolina experience. And I think that's why I noticed it, because some of the comments that were said to me in having people who spoke Spanish come into my house to do things in my house, and the people who were recommending these people were saying to me, were saying as if being Spanish or speaking Spanish was a detriment or something I may not want to have in my house at a particular time. And now, I don't know if that's just here or if it's all over South Carolina. My feeling about the rest of South Carolina is that it's all over South Carolina. So I think the point I was trying to make is that we don't have the time or the energy to be spent on separating Black and brown people in that way, or any people in that way. We have to really work at working together, whether we speak Spanish or Greek or what's the English, the Indian language, or any language. If we're going to be America, we have to be Americans. Americans, we are all not from this place except for Native American Indians. And you know what we've done to them. Yeah. But we need to get together as immigrants from wherever we came from, however we came here, to work together to make America, because we can be the greatest thing that God has ever created. We can be that in America if we just work at it.
Thank you, Jean.
So that's what I'm here about.
Thank you, Jean.
That's awesome, Jean. Thank you.
Can I add? Yeah, can I just add one comment? So, because I've lived in Mexico and different Central American countries, in rural areas where, and not everyone, but where there are a lot of people coming from rural and urban areas to South Carolina, right? And other parts. So I say that because I think also looking at racism in, let's just say, Mexico, has been denied for a very long time until recently. The Afro-Mexican reality, it wasn't until last year, I think it was, or a year and a half ago, that people could even check that on the census to identify them. Before that, they didn't exist, legally. And so I just think that that's a really important point, because recognizing where people are coming from and their notions of, or lack of notion about race, or denying that racism in their societies exists, and then the stereotypes that they have when they come to the US, especially of African Americans, is something that we have to talk about. And those conversations have to be had, because there's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah.
I want to say that something, I was going to say something else, but something she just said triggered that. I was talking to a person from Africa one time, and I said, what do you learn about us before you come over here as an African American? I'm a college professor. I teach grad students, and I teach a lot of African students. And one of the things that she said was that we shouldn't mix with y'all. And Africans are actually told that they shouldn't mix with us. That hurt me. And she said, but now that I've met African Americans, I know that's not true. Another thing is they denied the fact that I was talking to this man, and he was obviously an African man. He was Egyptian, and he has to put white on the census because he's from Northern Africa. If you are from Northern Africa and you come to America, you have to put white on the census.
You don't have to.
He said he was told to put white on the census. That's what he was seen as. The other thing I want to say is, as a professor, I used to teach at the University of South Carolina. I used to teach in undergraduate nursing for 5 years. And I noticed, and my experience has been from being in nursing for 29 years, growing up in South Carolina, we had one Hispanic family in our high school. I mean, I was from rural South Carolina, and they were Hispanic Americans, but their last name were Falcon. They were from Texas. But my whole experience, and I'm 49 years old, is that I've seen two things happen. The Hispanic people that I have come in contact with, they tend to hang in silos among other Hispanic people. That's one thing I noticed, even in school, even as my students, they hung in silos. The other thing, if they're not hanging in silos, they navigate more to the white students than the African American students. I have even tried to create groups of minority groups and pull them in. And I get more white students pulled in. I used to be the supervisor of Chi Phi. It's a Black nursing sorority. We were very inclusive. We pulled in white students into the sorority. It was a major thing. And one white student, she was very progressive. I loved her to death. She even ran for president of Chi Phi. That was the first. We would give those same opportunities to Hispanic students. We want to be more inclusive. We want to pull them in, but they don't always, they're not always receptive to being a part of it. And maybe it's cultural, maybe we're not using appropriate approach culturally. I'm open to learning more and how to approach them, but they do tend to either navigate more to the white side or they hang in silos.
Okay.
So that's been my experience. That's just a personal experience.
Thank you, Dr.
That's
Williams.
been my experience as well. Oh, I'm sorry.
Thank you, ma'am. We need to wrap this up. Has anybody got something they hadn't said they want to say? Jean, you
yeah, I just want to say just one thing. You are talking to, when you talk to Spanish speaking children or adults or whatever, you're not dealing with one, you're really dealing with maybe three problems that they face. They face the language, the color, because they're not white. They face the language experience, and they face the family experience that is very not different, but makes them different from what the experiences that you have, even as a Black person. If you're Black in America, you have a couple of problems. If you're Black and you're Hispanic in America, you have more problems. So with the Native, I'm not surprised that they didn't jump to you. First of all, they have to overcome the fact that they were taught that you don't go to Black people because they don't have anything for you. Then you have to go deal with the language. Then you have to deal with the family structure. So you have to do, okay, my sister-in-law is telling me to shut up. So I will, but
the wise woman.
So I'm going.
Thank you, Jean. Now, right. Anybody else gonna like pop if they don't say goodbye or hello? Okay.
Bye-bye all.
Bye-bye. I really do appreciate it. I think this is a wonderful opportunity to share some things, and this kind of after session chat is very valuable. Yeah. Thank you all, and I appreciate
Good night.
it. And I'm going to tell you the song that we're all going to learn before it's all over with. We have come too far, we can't turn around. We'll flood the streets with justice. We are freedom bound. One of our comrades wrote that at Highlander many years ago. This is our anthem, and we're going to share it with you, and you will all know it, or you will be made to march around the block several times. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
See you soon.
Good night, y'all. Peace.
I got my wine.
Good? Sir?
I got my wine, man.
Where? I don't even know where you are. I don't know what county you're in, Amari.
Somewhere between Richland and Calhoun.
You're apparently not driving for a change.
No.
Keith, thank you so much for participating. And I think Afia's probably gone to sleep. Thank you, Afia.